The courtroom was packed, a sea of expectant faces filling the gallery, their whispered conversations a low hum beneath the weight of what was about to unfold. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the polished wooden benches and the imposing mahogany judge's bench at the front of the room. This wasn't just another legal proceeding, it was a battle. And Pam Bondi had come prepared for war. She walked through the double doors with the kind of deliberate grace that commanded attention, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her posture as steady as steel. She had faced her fair share of high-stakes confrontations, had stared down corrupt officials and power-hungry bureaucrats before, but today was different. Today, she wasn't just fighting for a case. She was fighting to expose the very man who sat on the bench, the man who had spent years twisting the law for his own gain while hiding behind his robe, Judge Samuel Whitmore, a man who had ruled over this courtroom with unchecked authority, issuing decisions that favored the rich, the connected, the ones who knew exactly which strings to pull. He had buried evidence, silenced whistleblowers, and manipulated the system under the guise of legal precedent. And yet, he had never been touched, never been questioned. Until now. Pam approached the plaintiff's table, setting her leather case down with measured control. Across the room, Whitmore sat perched in his elevated seat, his expression unreadable, but his presence heavy. He was an older man, his silver hair perfectly combed, his black robe draped over his broad shoulders like a suit of armor. His reputation had shielded him for years, allowing him to operate in the shadows, untouchable. But Pam had spent months dismantling that shield. She could feel his eyes on her, the barely perceptible tension in his jaw as she pulled out her files. He knew why she was here, and if he didn't, he was about to find out. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, his voice booming through the chamber, but the energy in the room was already charged. The spectators leaned forward, their curiosity sharp. Some were reporters, their pens poised over notepads. Others were legal experts, colleagues, and even former defendants whose cases had been decided by the man on the bench. They had all come, here for one reason, to see what happened when someone finally challenged Judge Whitmore. Pam didn't waste time. She turned, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I have a preliminary matter that must be addressed." Whitmore barely lifted his gaze from the papers in front of him. "Ms. Bondi, this court does not entertain interruptions before opening arguments." And Pam arched an eyebrow, her expression unwavering. "This isn't an interruption. It's a matter of judicial misconduct." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. A shift of unease swept through the room. Even the court stenographer hesitated, her fingers momentarily frozen above the keys. Whitmore's eyes darkened, his fingers tightening on his gavel. "That's a serious accusation," he said, his tone clipped. Pam met his gaze without flinching. "And I have serious proof." A charged silence fell over the room. For the first time in his career, Judge Whitmore wasn't the one in control, and he knew it. Judge Whitmore's grip on his gavel tightened, his knuckles whitening against the polished wood. The courtroom had gone completely silent, the weight of Pam Bondi's words pressing down on every person in the room like a held breath. He leaned forward, his sharp, silver-gray eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice smooth but carrying a dangerous undertone, "I would caution you to tread carefully. Accusations of judicial misconduct are not to be thrown around lightly." Pam didn't blink. "And corruption shouldn't be hidden behind a black robe, Your Honor." A gasp rippled through the spectators. Someone in the back muttered something, under their breath. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his holster, not because there was a physical threat, but because everyone in that room could feel the tension turning razor-sharp. Whitmore sat back, the creases around his mouth tightening. He had been on the bench long enough to know how to control a courtroom, to assert his authority with the slightest shift in his voice. But for the first time, there was something different in his demeanor. Not fear. No, he had spent too many years bending the law in his favor to be afraid of a challenge. But uncertainty. A flicker of calculation as he tried to assess just how much Pam really had on him. He folded his hands together. If you have something substantive to present, Ms. Bondi, do so now. Otherwise, we will proceed as scheduled. Pam exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her like a second skin. This was it. The beginning of the end for him. She reached into her leather case, pulling out a thick manila folder. With deliberate ease, she stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as she approached the bench. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, forcing Whitmore to sit there, forcing him to wait. Then, she placed the folder down on the wooden surface of his bench with a single, measured movement. This, she said, her voice cutting through the silence, is a full dossier detailing financial transactions that connect you to off-the-record payments from defense attorneys who have appeared before you in court. The effect was instantaneous. Murmurs exploded through the gallery, loud and frantic, as people turned to each other, wide-eyed. Even the most seasoned legal professionals, who had seen every trick in the book, looked taken aback. Whitmore, to his credit, remained still. But there was something in his expression now. Something cold. Something rigid. His gaze flicked down, at the folder, then back up at her. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice low, controlled. Pam tilted her head slightly. "What's outrageous is that it took this long for someone to bring this to light." Whitmore's fingers drummed once against the wood, the only outward sign of the calculation happening behind his eyes. Pam didn't give him a chance to recover. She reached into her case again, this time producing a USB drive. "In case you'd like to argue that documents can be fabricated, I also have wire transfers, bank records, communications between you and intermediaries who facilitated these payments." A single bead of sweat formed at Whitmore's temple. He wiped it away quickly, but Pam saw it. The courtroom was a powder keg now, the whispers turning frantic. A journalist near the front row had already begun typing furiously on his phone, likely sending the breaking news to his editor. Others were whispering to one another, trying to make sense of the unfolding spectacle. Pam let the silence stretch again. Then she turned back toward the spectators, addressing them now. How many cases were decided under Judge Whitmore's authority? How many defendants, people who believed they were getting a fair trial, were actually trapped in a courtroom where the outcome had already been bought? The weight of her words sent a shiver through the room. Whitmore, for the first time, looked rattled. Pam knew he was trying to find an angle, trying to calculate whether he could intimidate her into backing down, whether he could somehow talk his way out of this. But he couldn't. Not this time. She turned back to him, meeting his gaze head-on. "I am formally requesting that you recuse yourself from this case, effective immediately," she said, her tone unwavering. Whitmore didn't respond right away. His fingers flexed slightly against the gavel, his mind racing. He had spent decades controlling rooms just like this, bending the law in his favor while keeping his hands clean. But now he was cornered, and he knew it. The air inside the courtroom had shifted entirely. The sense of decorum that had once governed the space had been shattered, replaced by an almost tangible crackle of anticipation. People weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting to see if, for the first time in his career, Judge Samuel Whitmore would finally fall. Pam Bondi remained standing before the bench, her presence a force of steady, unrelenting pressure. She had played this game long enough to know exactly how men like Whitmore operated. They weren't accustomed to being challenged. Not here, not in their own domain, not where they had the power to control every move. But this was different. Because for the first time, Whitmore had lost that control. He knew it. The realization sat heavily on his shoulders, his stiff posture betraying the calm facade he was so desperately trying to maintain. His gavel remained motionless in his grip, the polished wood cool against his fingers, but there was no authority left in the gesture. Pam had ripped that from him. The murmurs in the gallery had turned into full-fledged conversations now, people leaning toward one another, whispering hurriedly, their words laced with shock and intrigue. A few attorneys in the back were exchanging knowing glances, their eyes carrying the weight of a long-awaited reckoning. The press was already moving, phones buzzing with news alerts, hands furiously typing notes that would turn into tomorrow's headlines. Whitmore cleared his throat. "This is highly irregular, Ms. Bondi." His voice was level, but there was an unmistakable tightness to it. "If you think you can walk into my courtroom and throw around baseless accusations, these are not baseless accusations." Pam's voice cut through the room like a blade. She reached into her folder again, this time producing a series of documents clipped together. With slow, deliberate steps, she walked toward the clerk's desk and set them down. "These are certified transaction records," she continued, turning back toward Whitmore. "Wire transfers, dated within days of rulings you've issued. Every single one traces back to accounts that, interestingly enough, have direct ties to defense attorneys whose clients have miraculously received favorable verdicts." Whitmore's face remained carefully neutral, but his fingers curled slightly against the bench. Pam wasn't finished. She took another step forward, lowering her voice just enough that every syllable carried weight. "You can call it irregular all you want, Judge, but what's truly irregular is a pattern of case outcomes that directly correlate with hidden financial transactions." More murmurs, more movement in the gallery, people shifting, adjusting, recalculating the power dynamics of the room in real time. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're dangerously close to contempt, Ms. Bondi." Pam let out a slow breath, tilting her head slightly. "I think we both know I'm not the one in contempt here." For the first time, the judge hesitated. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, betraying the tension he had worked so hard to suppress. He reached for his water glass, lifting it with slightly unsteady fingers before taking a slow sip. It was a subtle move, meant to buy time, to collect his thoughts, to recover. But Pam didn't give him that chance. She turned toward the bailiff. "Officer, I'd like to formally enter these exhibits into the record." The bailiff hesitated, eyes flicking toward Whitmore as if seeking permission. This was unprecedented, evidence being introduced in real time against the judge presiding over the case. But Whitmore's silence was damning. He knew that denying this motion outright would only make things worse. Finally, with measured reluctance, the bailiff stepped forward and retrieved the documents, carrying them over to the court clerk. Pam felt the shift in the room deepen. The balance of power had fully tilted. Whitmore's own clerk, a woman who had worked alongside him for years, reached for the papers with careful hands, her expression unreadable. She was processing the weight of what was happening, and she wasn't alone. Every attorney in the room, every journalist, every defendant who had once stood before Whitmore, they were all watching the inevitable unfold before them. Pam crossed, her arms, her gaze never leaving the man on the bench. "I'll repeat my request," she said, her voice firm. "You need to recuse yourself from this case immediately." Whitmore exhaled sharply, rubbing his fingers against the bridge of his nose. His mind was undoubtedly racing through his options, but they were dwindling fast. If he recused himself now, it would be an implicit admission of guilt. If he refused, the scrutiny would only intensify. And then, the final nail in the coffin. One of the reporters sitting near the front suddenly stood. "Judge Whitmore, Do you have any comment on the ongoing ethics investigation into your financial dealings? The words struck the room like a thunderclap. Pam's chest tightened in satisfaction. So they had finally found it. She had suspected that once she made her move, the right people would dig into Whitmore's past, start pulling at the threads she had left exposed. And now, with that single question, the story had expanded beyond the confines of this courtroom. Whitmore's head snapped toward the journalist. "There is no ethics investigation," he said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Another journalist, this one a woman from a well-known national outlet, spoke up next. "Actually, Your Honor, there is. The Judicial Oversight Committee confirmed it this morning. Would you care to clarify the scope of their inquiry?" A heavy silence followed. Pam saw it. The second Whitmore realized it was over. His shoulders stiffened, his eyes darting toward the exit for the briefest moment. He wasn't going to fight. He wasn't going to argue. He was going to run. Pam stepped back, allowing the full force of his downfall to settle over the room. This wasn't just about recusing himself from one case anymore. This was about his entire career. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were talking openly, freely. Lawyers were exchanging glances, murmuring about appeals, about prior cases that might now be called into question. The defendants who had suffered under Whitmore's rulings were already considering their next moves. And Whitmore? He looked small. His once commanding presence had shrunk beneath the weight of scrutiny, his usual confidence eroding into something far more human. Fear. Finally, he exhaled, his voice a barely contained growl. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll recuse myself." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Pam remained still, absorbing the moment. He had given in, but she wasn't done. "Not just from this case," she said, stepping forward again. "From all of them." Whitmore's head snapped toward her, his jaw tightening. But before he could argue, before he could even attempt to salvage what little dignity he had left, the first flashbulb went off. A reporter had taken his picture, and, just like that, Judge Samuel Whitmore wasn't a judge anymore. He was a scandal, a headline, a cautionary tale. Pam allowed herself one last glance at him before turning on her heel, walking back to her seat. She could already hear the conversation swirling behind her, the chaos unfolding, but none of it mattered, because she had done what no one else had dared to do. She had ended him. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It had become an arena. The battle had been fought. The winner had been declared. And now, all that remained was the fallout. Judge Samuel Whitmore sat frozen on the bench, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking between the journalists in the gallery and the legal professionals murmuring among themselves. The once unquestioned authority of the courtroom had been stripped from him, and it wasn't coming back. Pam Bondi remained standing, her posture unwavering. She could feel the heat of the moment pressing against her, but she didn't let it crack her composure. She had seen this before, how quickly power could shift, how a single moment of exposure could turn a king into a pawn. Whitmore wasn't just a corrupt judge anymore. He was damaged goods. The reporters were already moving, whispering into their phones, sending frantic messages back to their editors. The moment the news hit the wires, it would spread like wildfire. The public loved a scandal, but they especially loved watching a figure of power crumble under the weight of their own deception. Whitmore had been untouchable for decades, and now, in the span of a few minutes, he had been reduced to something much smaller. "Your Honor," one of the attorneys in the crowd spoke up, a seasoned defense lawyer whose cases had repeatedly been shut down by Whitmore's dubious rulings. His voice carried just enough edge to signal his disdain. "Given the circumstances, I think it's fair to ask, how many of your past cases should now be considered compromised?" Whitmore inhaled, sharply, his grip tightening on the gavel. "This court will not entertain," Pam cut him off. "This court is no longer yours." The words hung in the air, absolute. Whitmore's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his bench. He was still trying to play by the old rules, still pretending he had the authority to shut this down. But the reality was sinking in. His voice didn't carry the weight it once did. His words, once feared, now rang hollow. From the back of the room, another voice spoke up. "Does this mean past rulings can be challenged?" Pam turned her head slightly, catching sight of a young woman in a sharp blazer, standing with a notepad in hand. A legal analyst, no doubt, already preparing to dissect the full ramifications of what had just unfolded. Pam gave a slow nod. Absolutely. That was the final crack in the dam. People erupted into conversation. Attorneys huddled in groups, debating how many of their cases could be appealed. Defendants who had once been railroaded by Whitmore's rulings were suddenly seeing a path forward. Some of the families in the gallery, the ones who had been forced to accept unfair sentences for their loved ones, were whispering frantically among themselves, their expressions shifting from quiet despair to something much more potent: hope. The bailiff looked overwhelmed, his eyes darting between the judge and the growing unrest in the room. Even Whitmore's clerk was frozen, staring at the documents Pam had entered into the record as if they had just rewritten history. Whitmore straightened in his seat, his pride refusing to let him look as cornered as he was. "This court is adjourned," he said finally, his voice barely masking his fury. He slammed the gavel down with force, but instead of commanding the room, the sound barely cut through the noise. Pam watched as he stood, adjusting his robe as if that simple act could restore the authority he had lost. He stepped away from the bench. But the moment he did, the cameras followed. Click, flash, click. The media had their shot. A disgraced judge walking away from the very courtroom he had once ruled with impunity. His name was already being drafted into headlines, his legacy reduced to a scandal that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Pam turned back toward the gallery. A few people were already approaching her, reporters with their recorders out, lawyers who wanted to know just how deep this corruption went. She held up a hand. "You'll have answers soon," she said simply. "But right now, I have work to do." The meaning was clear. This wasn't over. It wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was about the entire system that had allowed him to thrive. Pam had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. The doors of the courtroom swung open as Judge Whitmore disappeared through the exit, the back of his black robe billowing slightly as he retreated down the corridor. It was the walk of a defeated man, a predator forced to face the reality that his time at the top of the food chain had ended. The press knew it. The attorneys knew it. Even the court staff, who had spent years carrying out his orders without question, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. The courtroom itself had become a battlefield of murmurs and shifting allegiances. Some of the lawyers who had once aligned themselves with Whitmore were already slipping toward the exits, undoubtedly planning how they could distance themselves from the scandal. Others stayed behind, drawn to the energy of what had just transpired. Pam Bondi stood at the center of it all. She was still standing near the plaintiff's table, the evidence she had submitted now resting in front of the clerk like an exposed nerve. The documents, the financial records, the undeniable proof of Whitmore's corruption, it was all out in the open now. There was no stuffing it back into the shadows. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She ignored it for now. Whatever was happening, outside these walls could wait. "Ms. Bondi!" One of the reporters finally broke through the crowd, his voice urgent. "Do you expect an immediate resignation from Judge Whitmore?" Pam turned slowly, taking in the growing cluster of journalists. Their notebooks out, their cameras aimed at her. The moment she spoke, her words would be everywhere, on television, on social media, in the headlines that would be written before the ink on Whitmore's career was even dry. She let the silence stretch before answering. "He should step down." she said evenly. "But knowing men like him, I doubt he will. Not yet." The reporters leaned in. "What happens now?" another voice called out. Pam glanced at the pile of evidence on the clerk's desk. "Now?" She exhaled slowly. "Now, we do what should have been done years ago. We make sure he faces the consequences of his actions." Another journalist interjected. "Do you think other judges are involved?" That question made the room still again. Pam met the journalist's gaze head-on. "Let's just say," she said carefully, "Whitmore wasn't operating in a vacuum." The murmurs intensified. Because that was the real story, wasn't it? Whitmore had been the first domino to fall, but he wouldn't be the last. A door near the judge's bench opened suddenly, and a man in a crisp gray suit stepped into the room. He was flanked by two others, their movements precise and purposeful. Pam recognized them instantly. Internal Affairs. So it had begun. The lead investigator, a no-nonsense man in his mid-50s with graying temples and sharp eyes, nodded once at Pam before addressing the room. "This court is now under review," he announced. "Judge Whitmore's conduct is the subject of an immediate investigation. If you have information regarding judicial misconduct, you will have an opportunity to submit testimony." The defense attorneys scoffed from the gallery. "It's about damn time." Pam crossed her arms, watching as the court staff absorbed the news. Some looked relieved, others looked terrified. Because the truth was, when one man fell, he often took others down with him. Whitmore had ruled over this courtroom for years. How many others had known? How many had helped cover his tracks, accepted his rulings without question, benefited from his corruption? Pam wasn't leaving here until she found out. She turned back toward the clerk's desk, reaching for her phone. As she did, this time she checked the message. It was a news alert. Breaking. Judge Whitmore under official investigation. Judicial corruption scandal unfolding in real time. Pam smiled to herself. The wheels were already turning. And this was far from over. Pam Bondi sat in the deposition chair, her hands folded calmly on the table in front of her. Across from her, James Carden and his team of investigators prepared their notes, their faces unreadable but intent. The air in the room was thick with the weight of what was happening, what had happened. Outside these walls, the world was already moving, headlines spreading like wildfire, reporters dissecting every detail, legal teams scrambling to reassess the cases that had been tainted under Whitmore's rule. She had set all of this in motion, and yet, sitting here now, she felt no sense of victory, no smug satisfaction, just resolve. Carden finally looked up from his notes. "Shall we begin?" Pam nodded. "Let's." The recorder clicked on, its tiny red light glowing steadily. This was the final step. Whitmore was finished, and the system that had protected him for so long was beginning to unravel. There would be more hearings, more investigations, more names dragged into the light. But that was no longer her fight. She had done her part. She had exposed the corruption, forced justice to wake up, and ensured that power no longer shielded those who had abused it. As she spoke, detailing every piece of evidence, every connection that had led to this moment, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. Not entirely, there was always another battle to fight, but enough to know that this one was over. By the time she left the courthouse that evening, the sky had darkened, the city humming with the restless energy of a world that never truly slept. A cool breeze swept through the streets, carrying the sound of distant sirens and the faint murmur of reporters still camped outside, waiting for the next development. Pam paused at the steps, glancing up at the courthouse behind her. The lights, inside, still burned brightly, casting long shadows across the pavement. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away.